3 o'clock. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and a pleasure to have you here for this special afternoon discussing, I think, a very topical issue on which we read every moment in the media: digital resilience. Digital resilience, especially as seen, as we see in Ukraine. And I said it's in the news almost every day. We read about it all the time. It's an issue of even controversy at the moment. So very happy we can host this seminar, but also webinar, because there are many people participating online with the EBRD, also related to the launch of a special report on law in transition. But we will launch this report around 4 o'clock. We'll first have this panel debate, at which we're starting now, with I think 3 very good speakers. We have Mark from the EBRD. We have a market representative, Nana Louise from Microsoft. We have Piers from the European Commission. Thank you for joining us. And we have one of our fellows, Tina, who's worked on this subject as one of our projects which we had on the DCFTAs, the FTAs which we have with these associate countries, no, candidate countries, almost all of them. So we will, I think, have an interesting discussion about the subject. For me, it was also an honor to have this, because EBRD, for me, when I started working here a long time ago, I used a lot of the EBRD reports on transition, which was in the 90s, when you had the famous economics department with Erik Berglof, well-known economist. And we used these reports all the time to see, let's say, to monitor, at that time, the Central and Eastern European countries on their way towards accession of the EU. When, of course, accession was at that time not yet formally, probably on the somewhere in the stars, but not yet, nothing was formal yet. But then it became more formal, and the EBRD was, of course, a very important contributor to this entire process. So if you now see that we are basically back discussing a new form of transition with a new form of countries, I think that is extremely interesting. It's also interesting because the EBRD at the time did very good work in trying to quantify all these elements in the transition, and its reports were kind of used very widely. So again, happy to do this. But if we follow this in the news on a day-to-day basis, we know what the effort will be for a transition of which we are speaking now, because we are speaking about a country in war, a country which is being attacked every moment almost, and the cost of this war is enormous. So I think from an EU and European perspective, we will need to have all the actors which are there readily available, prepared for the reconstruction, one of the elements which we'll discuss this afternoon, of Ukraine, because, as I said, it is being kind of done damage on a day-to-day basis. But also, this country, for me, has been very resilient as well. And one of the things which we'll discuss this afternoon is this digital resilience. I'm surprised, but that's what we're discussing just in preparing this seminar, how resilient Ukraine has been and continue to function as a state on a day-to-day basis, at least from what I can observe. We will discuss about this in a moment, because some people on this panel have been in Ukraine. I haven't been there recently, so it will be useful to hear that, and also useful to hear the questions and the comments which we get about this from the participants. Of course, we will not limit ourselves to Ukraine specifically. We'll look at the region a bit larger. I mentioned one of our fellows has done work on that. We have 2 new candidate countries in the region. We have others which are associate states of the EU. There are others, parts of the region where we want to act more decisively as an EU. So digital resilience in our day-to-day cooperation with these countries is extremely important. So that's why, again, I think it's very useful that we can discuss this. We can discuss this, as we were preparing before, from a policy perspective, what actors are doing, but also what operators are doing, and what we, as kind of observers from a think tank, learn from these experiences. We will have about 1 hour for this initial panel. Of course, they will not be speaking all the time. We'll look at you as well. We'll look at what questions we get from the digital participants or the remote participants. But again, we are there also to listen to your questions, and we hope we can have a lively debate. And with this, let me start probably with, we have basically 3 questions, but we will start with Mark with the first question, what he thinks we have learned so far in digital resilience from the country about which we're speaking most, and how do you see this from an EBRD perspective, Mark? And thank you again, let's say, for the cooperation with EBRD on this subject. You just put it on and it will work. Yes.
Hello?
No, you have to put it.
Yeah, that's better. Okay, Carl, thank you very much, and I should thank you very much for hosting this this panel, and say it's a real pleasure to be here. I actually wanted to start just by setting out very briefly our response to the Ukraine crisis as a whole, because I think it's such an important topic. And as you know, the EBRD has had a very deep and long-standing relationship with Ukraine for 30 years, basically. And over those 30 years, we have invested almost 20 billion in the country. That has made us one of the, or probably the largest institutional investor in Ukraine. We have a very strong presence on the ground, and in recent years we have worked with the EU on something called the Ukraine Reform Architecture, which essentially is a network of Ukrainian consultants embedded in various ministries across in Kiev, a very important resource in terms of helping build capacity and push forward reforms. In terms of our response to the war, we made a decision as a bank very early on that we wanted to continue to invest in Ukraine at the same level as we had been investing before the war, and we have done that through a combination of taking risk on our balance sheet, probably to a degree more than any other international financial institution, but also relying on support from donors. So essentially, we have gone into a kind of 50-50 risk-sharing arrangement with donors, where we take half the risk on our balance sheets and half is supported by guarantees from donors. And I should say that we have been very successful in terms of getting support from donors. In terms of the specifics of what we have done, now the EBRD's role is obviously not to provide budget support. There are other organisations that do that. It's not to provide humanitarian support. Our role has been, where possible, to help support the functioning of the economy, to help the basic functioning of the economy, critical for supporting livelihoods and critical for ensuring that the state continues to function. So we have done, we've done trade finance, we have done support for state-owned enterprises, for example, loans to the railway company, to the gas company, to the electricity company, all, as I say, to help support the basic functioning of the economy. We have also supported agribusiness through credit lines and risk-sharing arrangements with banks. Our initial focus has very much been on providing liquidity support, but we find that we are increasingly getting into the area of not full-scale reconstruction, because obviously we're not yet at that phase, but what we would describe as emergency repairs for critical infrastructure, something that I think is incredibly important. And you saw the terrible events last week and the destruction of parts of the electricity grid as an example of the immediate damage, and other parts of vital infrastructure have already been damaged. So that is very much our focus at the moment, providing liquidity support and providing emergency support in terms of repairing key and critical infrastructure. Of course, we are very much engaged in the debate about reconstruction, the challenges of reconstruction, the opportunities that will bring, and I'm sure we will talk more about the digital element to that, the opportunities there, but also the kind of the risks and the challenges. But I think for the moment, all I want to say, but we can come back to this, is the debate on reconstruction is enormously important. And that requires coordination and planning at this stage, and this conversation should and is happening. It's also extremely important that that conversation doesn't detract from the immediate challenge of supporting Ukraine now through the winter and into next year. And that challenge is both a financial one, but also a reform challenge. But let me stop there by way of introduction. But there are many issues that we can.
Could I ask one follow-up question? Since you're starting this webinar, but you're also in a privileged position as an international institution. I mean, how do you judge this resilience of Ukraine now after 8 months? How has it worked also from your perspective, the coordination between all these international institutions which are supporting Ukraine, and how does it come that, I mean, the way I see it, of course, again, I'm an external observer, that it has worked so well, at least the way I see it until today?
No, and that's a very good question, and I think it goes without saying. I mean, the resilience of the Ukrainian people has been absolutely extraordinary, and the functioning of the state, the functioning of the ministries, the challenges that they have faced on the policy sides, the economic policy decisions that they've had to take have been enormous. But the way that they have operated as a state, the policy decisions they have made, just shows enormous resilience. And you know, before this session, we were talking about the success, obviously the critical importance of digital resilience. But also the question of how successful they have been in terms of keeping things operating, using digital means to continue communicating with citizens, interactions between citizens and the states, moving to digital platforms. You know, again, I'm sure we will come on to this. The questions around cybersecurity and the pressures they have faced there, but the way that they have dealt with those pressures, the way that they have dealt with issues around data security. So I don't have a single answer to your question except to say that their resilience has been enormously impressive.
Thank you, and I think that has impressed us all. We turn to Tina. Tina is a colleague from SEPS, as I said, has done work on these matters in the context of what we call here in Brussels the DCFTAs, and specifically on digital. But start with this overall question, Tina, from your perspective. How do you judge it, let's say, the overall response to this war and the resilience of the country in question, but also of the region, probably?
Thanks a lot, Karel. Maybe I will start a very brief overview of what has been going in the region, because this is a very particular region as we know it, the disputed region between Russia and the European Union. But the EU has its own policy vis-a-vis these countries, including Ukraine, right? So it was back in 2008, after the war of Russia against Georgia, that EU has put forward the Eastern Partnership Policy, EIP. And then within this framework, I mean, we're talking really 2 decades behind from now on. Within this policy framework, the EU had a particular policy, which apparently digital and cyber dimension was not that really strongly developed back then, because EU back then didn't even have its own digital single market, right? Digital single market comes only after 2015, and then we have all these, you know, changed legislations and new updated policies. And that was not really streamlined, you know, properly into the EIP policy. We can distinguish several things that have happened as a success story from the EU side, and this mainly concerns connectivity. There is the EIP Connect project that was a big success, if you ask me, because we take it granted. For instance, in the European Union, we have a connected, you know, academics, students, universities, free Wi-Fi. This was not the case in the region. We are talking about the region which is poor, which does not have strongly developed infrastructure, and there are regions, mountainous regions, where the internet penetration is very low. So building this connectivity, EIP Connect, was really key, which basically then led to the tenfold increase in connectivity in the region on average, and also the decrease of the prices to the access to internet by 60–70% on average, which is quite a good result within the EIP policy framework. But also the other thing was cybersecurity, which was really a bit lagging behind cooperation on that area. And let me zoom in also with the Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, because these countries have with the European Union association agreements and the DCFTAs. And these are so far the most, you know, deep and comprehensive agreements the European Union has with its neighbors. However, as these agreements were negotiated before the launch of the digital single market, they're very thinly lined on digital. They have only chapters on the, you know, cooperation on information society and electronic communications. No mention of cyber. And again, we're talking about the most deepest and comprehensive agreements. No mention of cyber. and very thin lines on the general, cooperation and electronic communications. And the legislation that is basically put into the annexes of these agreements, I must say, are already outdated because EU has moved forward with the, its digital policies in the European Union. And so far, what we could observe was the more, requests from the Eastern Partnership states to come closely to the EU in digital matters, in cyber matters, but that has been rather slow. It has been mainstreamed only into the updated Eastern Partnership Policy 2020 that now obviously lags behind because of the wars and all that, which now has the separate channel on digital transformation because we face it that it's very, very important domain and we have to really step up the cooperation in that direction. Now, regarding the resilience of Ukraine, Karel, so this is a very peculiar case because Ukraine has been very proactive developing digital sector. And let me flag a few numbers. So before the war in 2021, the IT services brought up to around 4% of the GDP contribution. That is not negligible, obviously, and they constituted up to the 10% of the IT exports of Ukraine. It's quite big, and then it has been also growing over the years, right? That is important, and given that importance, the Ukraine has invested time and resources to develop the DIA. Probably you're all aware of it. It's the smartphone application state into the smartphone. And that was immensely important because now when we have refugees, just to give you an example how this smartphone application is useful, these refugees, displaced people come to the EU states with their, digital documents. For instance, in Poland, they're recognized. They can come with their digital documents. On the other hand, that was a headache for Ukraine how to protect the privacy of the personal data, right? Because this is a registry of all the personal data, so there is security issues. So it's not an easy thing, but Ukraine has made a lot of legislative changes during the war, within the war. So that, I think, proves quite a lot that the country is resilient, but also country came ready because of this, digitalizing several important government services that made it ready to have digital, kind of having there and having it strong. Also, the country has the Ministry on Digital and Transformation. That's the only country in the region that has such a ministry, and I think this ministry, once functioning well, proved to be very useful on that matters. Maybe I will stop here.
So the 6 million which are living in the EU at the moment have continuous access with their families in Ukraine.
Well,
almost.
Well, we cannot really judge on numbers, but yes, probably they do. I mean, as long as there are the internet, access in Ukraine. But also, one of the many things that Ukraine has developed, maybe I'll mention that there is a chatbot that they've developed, which ensures the transfer of the security information that could be useful for security services in Ukraine without using internet. So they even have some small tools that can operate when it comes to security without internet. But let's assume they have access to the internet and they're connected.
A very important element also in the resilience. The resilience is the communication amongst people. So, yeah, which already brings us to the next speaker on this panel. Let's say how, as an operator, you look at this, and if you heard Tina's numbers, I mean, that is already impressive. Of course, that's where you need operators. How do you look at this, Anna-Louise?
So, first of all, it's great to be here. Yes, I mean, Microsoft's contribution to the resilience of Ukraine is really in 4 areas. So one of the most important areas I think that we have contributed is in cyber defense, identifying attacks and warning the Ukrainian government so that they had a chance to stop them. Also helping them to transfer data from their servers that were physically in Ukraine to the cloud outside of, in a data center outside of Ukraine, in case there would be, a physical attacks on some of the servers. This was the one area. Another area has been to help them with identifying and combating misinformation. Campaigns from Russia as well. The third area has been more like humanitarian support, money, products, free Skype calls, donations from our employees. We actually have contributed with $280 million. So it's quite significant. I think it's the most of any company. And the last one, maybe not so many people know, that we are working very closely with the International Court of Justice to collect and protect documentation for war crimes, so that when the war is over and somebody needs to be accountable, then we have...
So outside Ukraine, I imagine, in clouds?
Yes. And we've also been helping some of the NGOs outside of Ukraine. In Poland, for example, I was there with our leader for philanthropy, that a lot of humanitarian support there. Skilling, for example, in cybersecurity, skilling is an important area, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Just a general impression about, from the perspective of your firm, what do you hear inside the firm about the resilience of Ukraine from the perspective of kind of the sector you represent?
Yeah. No, very impressive, actually. I mean, Ukraine is the country in the world who gets around 20% of all cyber attacks. It has increased by 216% since the war started. I think it was from early February to mid-April, they had 40 attacks alone. And they still have a society that's actually functioning quite well. And this has been attacks on everything from essential facilities, communication systems, utilities, and so on. So, you still have a country that works, relatively nice. I think that says it all.
Yeah, that's surprising, and I think for many accounts surprising, and for many of us surprising. We move to the Commission, Piers. I'm very happy that you could join us today. Of course, you don't need to repeat what the Commission has done. We see this, we repeat this on a day-to-day basis on a general terms, but can probably more focus on your specific domain. How do you look at this resilience of Ukrainian society?
Yes, Carol, thank you indeed. Yeah, no point in repeating, but it is important to signal the political solidarity which started from day one, the sanctions, which we sometimes don't think about, but which collectively the European Union is able to bring to bear against the aggressors, and of course humanitarian aid. But exactly, as we look at the area that I'm able to talk about, when we look at the digital domain and digital resilience, well, first of all, I have to echo what you said and others, which is that we are so impressed, it's so incredible as to how resilient the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are proving to be. So we, the European Union, actually have a lot to learn from Ukraine with regard to resilience. So it's very much going to be a two-way discussion, and everyone will benefit from that experience. But of course, they're not benefiting, they're suffering. And so what we have to look at is what lessons can we learn from their suffering, from what they have had to do, to see does that apply elsewhere, for example, in Eastern Europe, but also for our own tools, particularly in the area of cybersecurity. But from the start, we've played a role as facilitator, in many cases just making introductions and then stepping back from actors who might not previously have worked together in order to ensure things like backup and the storing outside of Ukraine of data, but also actually the very critical technique of routing and rerouting communications, and particularly internet traffic, depending on how the front moved and where there were outages caused by Russian aggression. We also, in some cases, and this was an easy one for Brussels bureaucrats, was to help to overcome the few regulatory barriers that sort of turned up that one would not have imagined. But for example, in facilitating and supporting European telcos in providing roaming to all of the Ukrainian citizens who were displaced, but also to allow them to maintain telephone contact and internet contact. Of course, we had to just, with the national regulators, tweak a few of the rules so that Ukraine was fully covered, and that the operators would be fully compliant with their European legal obligations, which of course nobody intended them to be a barrier to that. It just we had to quickly move. Same for personal data protection and GDPR, a few tweaks that had to be made there. But the element that's been underlined is that of cybersecurity. The European Union framework for cybersecurity is actually quite recent, and I think this is what you were saying also. But clearly we had to focus on data security, on its provision, on backups, and also, once again, on learning with regard to, for example, the Estonian experiment of data embassies. suddenly became very real in terms of practical storing of data, sensitive Ukrainian government data in other jurisdictions. And the countries and the companies involved have, to a large extent, quite understandably chosen to remain anonymous for increased cybersecurity, but of course we very much welcome that. Then we had to allow greater cooperation between operators and service providers. On the EU's borders with Ukraine, there was a small number of telcos and internet service providers who bore the brunt of that. They did a huge job, to the extent that we know anecdotally of individuals helping for the on-field, battlefield repair of local connection facilities to ensure continued connectivity in certain areas. So those are a long list of things where modestly the European Union has tried to support. But of course we have also worked on things such as battling misinformation, disinformation, and seeking to stamp out propaganda as it arises across a number of platforms. And then looking forward to the next discussion, the next part of our discussion, of course, in terms of what have we done already. We fast-tracked the association of Ukraine with our spending programs, particularly in the research area, that's Horizon 2020, in specifically digital, the Digital Europe program. In early September, we announced that they were fully associated and can benefit from things such as deployment activities and cooperation with digitally advanced companies across Europe. And in the Connecting Europe facility, where again, there are digital interconnectors which are being multiplied to ensure that there are multiple lines of communication between Ukraine and the friendly countries that surround it mostly, in order to ensure that it is plugged into the European and global internet and that stays that way. But we can get into the funding perhaps later. Thank you.
One follow-up question. Do European citizens know enough about these initiatives, which are critically important for maintaining Ukraine up?
That's an interesting question. Probably not. But then, as you would expect and understand, our efforts have not been focused on telling people just what great things we're doing. It's like here, everyone in this room has been kept very busy on the Ukraine issue and hopefully contributing to that. And that's exactly what's happened within the European Commission, where we're working on a whole lot of areas we would not have expected to have to deal with in a crisis situation. So perhaps maybe telling the story more. I think some people are aware of the roaming story, for example, but there's an awful lot more to it. And then, as I've said, there's some of the story that people will never know, including myself. I have no need to know what are the routes for particular internet traffic, where it's being backed up or stored, and what companies or countries involved. It's better, in fact, that most people don't know these things.
For example, the temporary protection for social security, etc., was also a very important step. But if you wonder how many people really know about this and how critically important it is, I mean, and then you mentioned some specific examples in your domain, they are important, let's say, to maintaining this fabric together and the communication lines and the structures for that, which is, anyway. Yeah, we moved to a second phase, and I could take some questions in the meantime, let's say, but we had kind of first this tableau de bord, so to say, let's say, about where we are. Let's say we can move to a second phase in this discussion with Mark, let's say, about looking specifically about vulnerabilities, and there from there, where are we, meaning what will the reconstruction mean for Ukraine? If you look at it from your perspective, EBRD, let's say what specifically, of course, we have probably been discussing a bit more, I mean, how did they did it so good, let's say, but there are certainly many weaker spots, and of course there are some things which we read about on a day-to-day basis, and the cost of this, but how we will then take it on, which of course where the EBRD will come in very centrally together with other development banks.
Okay, let me start on digital and sort of general, and then come into the question of reconstruction and the kind of challenge there. So very briefly, the EBRD, we have three current strategic priorities or themes. First is green, second is equality of opportunity or inclusion, and third is digital. And clearly these three themes very much interact and link. I mean, digital needs to be green. Digital is a real opportunity in terms of promoting the green agenda. Digital provides opportunities for inclusion, but also kind of risks in terms of segments of society being left behind. In terms of our digital approach, which we set out last year, we divide it into sort of three key components. First of all, the foundations for a country being successfully digitally, the infrastructure, the resilience. Secondly, the work we do supporting countries and supporting companies that we invest in transform to become digital. And thirdly, promoting innovation. Now, clearly, moving on to the kind of question about Ukraine and reconstruction, clearly digital will be an incredibly important theme. All of those aspects I've just discussed will be incredibly important for Ukraine, and the kind of challenges, but also the opportunities are enormous. In terms of the kind of reconstruction effort, just a few points. I mean, first of all, it will require very significant resources. I think one thing that is very obvious is that yes, there will be a massive need for resources from governments, from international financial institutions, but mobilizing the private sector will be absolutely key. And in order to do that, one of the kind of core components will be a stable investment environment. So that highlights the importance of policy reform. Secondly, I think the question of coordination. I mean, clearly any reconstruction to be successful needs to be led by Ukraine, and it needs to be owned by the Ukrainians. But there is a very important requirement in terms of the IFIs, the international communities, coming round a Ukrainian-led plan and improving the level of coordination. And as I think you know, there are currently many kind of ongoing discussions about how exactly to structure that coordination. You can do it in different ways, but the fundamental point is that the efforts of donors, the efforts of the international community need to coalesce around a Ukrainian-led plan, which both prioritizes investments, but also at the same time promotes a very strong reform agenda. And obviously, the questions of EU membership and alignment with the EU will be a very important guiding principle in that journey.
Specifically about reconstruction, I mean, how do you plan for this at the EBRD at the moment? Meaning in terms of sums, let's say, what will it take from the means which the EBRD has, which it's already doing, I suppose. Let's say you're already assisting the public administration. But then if you look forward towards the huge reconstruction effort, again, as I was asking before, let's say the cooperation between the different international organizations will have to be enormous just to make it going.
The cooperation between the international organizations will have to be very, very significant. The sums of money are extremely large, and obviously there has to be a political conversation about how to address those needs. As I said earlier, the role of the private sector will be absolutely key in mobilizing private sector investment, and that depends on a business environment that attracts investment. I think in terms of the role of the EBRD, I mean, the EBRD will expect to play a very important role. Our focus is on combining investments with policy dialogue. That's our unique contribution, is that combination of investments, but a policy dialogue at the same time. And clearly, as the EBRD, we focus on the private sector, and we would expect to play an important role in terms of promoting a private sector-led recovery and reconstruction.
But for the private sector to step in, you will need to have a very stable legal framework, which, if you see it in today's context, is extremely difficult. Of course, they've done it well during this 8 years. I mean, 8 months. Tina referred, let's say, to this changing laws in a matter of a few days. But if you see it today, you will only have private sector involvement if the overall circumstances are.
Absolutely, and all the sort of very familiar issues from discussions about transition, but apply completely. You will only attract significant amounts of private investment if there is a stable legal framework, a stable regulatory framework. So the point being that the combination of investments that organisations like the EBRD can promote, but the policy dialogue will be extremely important. And the overall point that the challenges of reconstruction are very significant, and it requires an overall comprehensive plan that prioritises investments, but takes investments alongside the policy journey at the same time.
Okay, thank you. I move back to Tina. I mean, you can look at it from your perspective, as you've done that work on kind of readiness for this European framework, which is there, and how important it is today, Tina.
The policy, Carol. I mean, the policies. The policy is important. Maybe this is a good starting point to resume the discussion. Policy is there, but again, as I said, it has now within like 6 countries, which are quite different in their nature, right? We have Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and then we have Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Belarus still in the Belarus has withdrawn, but EU is still with the Belarusian people, right? So it's still in there in the policy framework. So obviously the policy has to be definitely reshaped, but I think there are more urgent things to be thinking now about. That's what we are having here, to keep Ukraine armed and to help country to survive. I think this is coming as a next step after we are a bit at the peace with the war, and then have a clear plan on the Ukraine's reconstruction. But I think the way region has developed also shows a good lessons learned for the EU, as a regional power who has the soft power, legislation, and its policies, that if you don't step up your cooperation with the countries who are ready to come closer to you, and I've already mentioned Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, which are ready to step up the cooperation for the main EU bodies on digital and mostly cybersecurity, ENISA, there are separate asserts, but the cooperation was not really advancing that fast. Now we are at the war, we are at the edge, and as Piers has mentioned, there are some legislative barriers have been turned off, and that eased certain cooperation. We could have, all I'm saying is the EU could have come more prepared to this state with the more extended cooperation even before the war, and also share more lessons even within the countries, because they have quite a lot to share. As now we're witnessing Ukraine's resilience. Georgia was the first country on which Russia has tested in parallel the defense, the military attack with the cyber attack. Ukraine in the past had a massive attack on the energy grid, up to 10 billion losses. So these regions have a lot to share with the EU, and the EU has a lot to share to them. So I think to that stage, we could have come more prepared if there was more extended, more enhanced cooperation, at least with these 3 countries who were definitely, strong on their European paths. Now, in terms of what Ukraine may be in need, again, a good starting point is to have a look where country was standing digitally before the outbreak of the war. Now, around 40% of the population didn't have computers at home. These are the numbers you can refer in the study Carol was referring to.
40% of which country?
In Ukraine, we're talking about, right? Now, before the pandemic, right? Then up to around 53% of the population didn't have advanced skills to use computers. This is according to the survey conducted by Ukraine itself. This is quite a large number, okay? And then the other 1/3 didn't use internet, for the other reasons, than other purposes than social media. Now, why I'm flagging that? Because there is a gap in the advanced digital skills. There is a gap in infrastructure, even having computers or knowing how to use them. But this, even though, does not refrain people from being very engaged on social media. And I'm flagging that just to resonate what Piers has been saying, the role of the disinformation, because we're talking about the region where, Kremlin, pro-Kremlin led disinformation campaigns are extremely successful. So in Ukraine, more than 80% of the population are on social media. There are other countries, the number is even higher. So that makes them really vulnerable. So I would say the internet penetration, internet infrastructure, lower digital skills, and high exposure through the social media. These are the vulnerabilities that were already there before the war. Now, at the war, what we have is like unemployment, according to the latest estimates, to my knowledge, was up to 53%. quite high. Ukraine needed monthly 5 billion gap, right, to operate, sorry, from month to month. Now, according to the new estimations, 3.5 billion monthly they will need. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of lost jobs, and there is a need for immediate action. In that, I understand all the things that we've been hearing at the presentation, you know, creating stable business environment, all that. These are the key, but that will require some time. And I think this is why, you know, the plan on reconstructing Ukraine should start basically now. And we should really think about how we will mobilize the money, because the money are just great. It's the huge sums of money that we will need. Also, the good positive side I would have, and I will stop here, Carol, sorry if I go a bit over time, is that we're talking about the society in a country which is extremely mobilized still, online as well. The good example here would be the crypto donations they've reached within the 3 weeks of the war. They've collected through the crypto donations up to 54 million US dollars in Ukraine. So this is the society, this is the country which is still tuned in. They can mobilize themselves very well, and these are the things in the region, but they still need, you know, some extra help to use these, you know, mobilizing strategies better. And I think that's where the coordination, good coordination from the EU, international organizations, EBRD obviously, and the key major private companies would be really helpful. Stop here.
Thanks, Tina. I had a question here. I don't know whether it can wait, or otherwise I move on, or you can wait until... Okay, but then we'll wait. But it's good that we have a question, but then we move to Nana Louise again, to again, looking at the reconstruction and also reacting to some of the data which Tina mentioned, where there's still a lot to be done.
Yes, I think I just got inspired by my co-panelist here to just step one step back, because I think, you know, the reconstruction of Ukraine, it's one of the big challenges we have in the world at the moment, climate, energy crisis being two other ones that I think we need to solve together. I mean, there's no government alone, no company alone, no think tank alone, no, you know, can solve this alone. You know, we need each other. Actually, Ukraine government has taken its own initiative as well, called Digital for Freedom, where they've invited tech companies to come up with suggestions for different areas. And Microsoft has responded and given suggestions as to e-health, e-education, cyber defense, of course, continued technological transformation. Two areas where I think that I think is important that I can mention here is it's a country that has huge problems with corruption. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And we had conversations with Zelensky even before the war broke out, where he really wanted to do something about this. And one of the big areas where they have problems is in customs. So this is one area where you could digitalize and make it much less vulnerable for bribes and so on. And I think another area was the one that I mentioned before around skilling. And cyber skilling is part of that, both in governments and in companies. Yeah.
A lot of work to be done for companies like yours, but also for many others. And if we think about reconstruction, but also probably not only to Ukraine, but also to the broader region, because we still don't know how this will look like today. We hope it won't last that long, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think some of the learnings we have from Ukraine, I think we could start applying to neighboring countries. You know, for example, how do we secure their data? And I liked your comment about the embassies, but you know, if there is a similar situation there, you know, how can they be better prepared maybe than Ukraine was? I think that's why I really like this topic of today.
Anyway, I mean, like we saw last week, there was the summit of some former Soviet countries, let's say, which met there, where Putin was as well. But also we had an European political community meeting where we had Armenia and Azerbaijan involved. So we see some borders which are fluctuating, and we don't know exactly which country will belong to which part, and that's where, let's say, there's also all these efforts which are undertaken from our side play a role. Yeah, probably I move on to Piers again, let's say, just to see how we widen this effort from kind of helping, I mean, immediate needs towards looking forward, let's say, towards more long-term needs for Ukraine, but also for the region.
Yeah, thank you. I do believe that from our perspective on digital, we have to start by analysing the vulnerabilities in order to understand what that means for Ukraine, but for the whole region as we move forward. It obviously will be dominated going forward by the reconstruction and development work led by the EBRD and other international financial institutions, but what will that be targeted at? So what we see in Ukraine, no surprise, first of all, is simply the vulnerability of physical infrastructure. Although surprisingly, and to the extent that we were getting paranoid about this, in the early days of the invasion, there was relatively little damage to communications infrastructure at the radio access network level, apart from radio masts, but the connection points to fiber cable backhaul was surprisingly resilient, we felt, although there were individuals in there having to patch things up and splice fiber literally under fire. But it is clear that that is always going to be the vulnerable element, and you have to really concentrate on where could you make an effect, which is that the backbone, as we call it, the connections between regions, between servers, and particularly in an internet context, between internet resolvers. And sorry, I'll try not to be too complex about it, but in terms of domain name servers, resolution, and the backups to the root servers, you need to have multiple paths and multiple backups. That's what professional companies do anyway in real time, you know, in peacetime for the security of their networks, but that has to be even more resilient. And that is something which we will have to see in all of the Eastern Partnership and Balkan countries, in our view, in terms of investment. The other vulnerability is one, well, we know about it, and to a certain extent, at a political level, we've accepted it. If you accept a global open internet where everyone has access, you expose yourself to the threat of propaganda, misuse, and of course, cyber attack. So we collectively, the European Union, will not at any point abandon our commitment to a global open internet where there is free access for all. So we have to build our protection against those who would seek to misuse and attack the European Union or any of the Eastern Partnership or Balkan countries as a result of that openness. And that's why the work on disinformation, but particularly the work on cybersecurity, is so important. So as I said, our cybersecurity cooperation at the level it's now operating is pretty recent, but there will have to be mechanisms to ensure that other like-minded countries can be very closely associated with that. There is a lot of cooperation going on again, but again, that's behind the scenes. But to provide comfort and confidence as well as actual practical resilience from cyber attack. So those would be two areas that, rather sort of looking then, translating that forward into the investment work, into the region, they would necessarily be part of any spending program. So the European Union financial programs that I mentioned, for example, the Digital Europe program, I wouldn't pretend for a moment that they are anywhere near the scale that's being talked about by EBRD, in other words, in terms of what is already, shall we say, the bill to be paid for reconstruction. But at least it brings Ukraine into the European family to learn, even in terms of research, to partner their research organizations with universities and research organizations within Europe to develop the capacity of their own. And that again is another issue for the next step, which is ensuring that we're investing in capacity. We've mentioned a lot digital skills, that's essential, but even digital capacity in terms of advanced skills where we have a significant cohort of the population who are able to actually work in these areas in digital technologies.
Could I ask a follow-up, a brief follow-up? How do you cooperate between different organizations at international level on cybersecurity? Meaning, we know, let's say, cybersecurity is addressed from a defense security perspective, is addressed from kind of operators perspective, telecommunication perspective, is addressed from a data privacy and so on. Meaning it involves multi-level governance.
It does, and just as an engineer, a cyber engineer, will be able to talk you through the process of different levels of data access, even going into a complex data center run by a commercial company, there will be certain employees who can get to the foyer and into the meeting room, but can't get beyond into the first set of data rooms, and there are others who, and you know, so it can be engineered also in terms of cooperation, that you have wide cooperation and discussion between all like-minded countries, or even those whom you would seek to be bringing on board. But of course, when it gets down to detailed operational matters, including operational cooperation, well, quite frankly, the partners pick themselves. And it's normally on the basis of our member states who have, of course, competence, final competence for their security, with others who are with whom they are associated, or where there is long-standing cooperation. But it can be done. It is actually, shall we say, that's a less difficult than some of the other issues in engineering those levels of cooperation.
So with candidate countries or associate states?
Well, yes, because increasingly now those candidate countries will actually have to have established and show that they are on the way to building this cyber resilience, but actually building the cybersecurity competence that European rules will oblige them to have when they become members.
Yes, you can speak to your counterpart in Ukraine on some of these technical issues.
Well, I don't have a counterpart in Ukraine. Well, I do actually, but certainly that person is not involved in cybersecurity. My colleagues dealing in cybersecurity, yes. But there is no formal cooperation yet. There is cooperation that has come about by force majeure.
Very good, very interesting. I mean, we see we're doing a lot, which again, let's say we are not seeing sufficiently, but which are not the glamorous thing of which we read in the newspapers, but which are very important to make things moving. As I said, there was a question already here. Nicholas White.
Thank you, Carol. Nicholas White from APCO Worldwide, but speaking in a purely personal capacity, it's been really fascinating to hear sort of reconstruction 2.0, 21st century conflict as compared to the olden days, and some of us were involved with the Balkans, 25 years ago when things were very, very different. So I have two questions coming out of that, one of which is quite general, one of them quite specific. The more specific one is, I don't think anybody has mentioned the United Nations or the ICRC, which would have been sort of the first organizations that would have come up in a discussion like this 25 years ago. I know that the UN efforts in Ukraine are being led by the FAO out of Rome, which is at first sight a slightly strange choice until you remember the importance of Ukrainian food security. But I'm just wondering whether either of these organizations is actually hitting your radar screen in terms of the digital and connectivity dimension. My second question, much more broadly, what's your sense of the mood music in Ukraine between the government and the private sector actors? Do you think that your external involvement is helping, or do you think it's not really, it would be about the same whether you were there or not?
Yeah, the second question, they could only say, I think, positively. Yeah? But anyway, I don't know whether Mark wants to address the first question. On the action, but probably that's mostly for you.
I can have a go at both if you want, but it's a good question about the UN. We have some contacts with them. I mean, maybe a general answer to a specific question, but if you think about Ukraine reconstruction, I think if you look at the kind of experience of reconstructions in the past, they've often been in very, very different countries to Ukraine. Ukraine is an industrialized country with a functioning, very competent, accomplished government that is actually working. So it's a very different context to some of the international reconstructions that have happened in sub-Saharan conflict states, for example. And I think it's important, and maybe that. I'm probably not expert enough on this, but maybe that is part of the answer as to why there's less focus on some institutions and more focus on other institutions. In terms of your question on the private sector, I mean, I think what we are doing in Ukraine at the moment is extremely important, and I very much hope very well received. I think if you talk about the private sector, though, you have to understand that it's a war situation, and war situations do not lend themselves to private sectors investing and making investment decisions. Which is why for the EBRD, which is, you know, as the EBRD, we are a private sector focused organisation, but most of our interventions so far have been around supporting state-owned enterprises and supporting basic infrastructure. We would like to do more in the private sector. We would like to do more to help businesses to expand and to grow, but obviously in a war situation there isn't an enormous amount of demand from private sector businesses to do that at this stage.
About the question on the UN, specifically, cooperation with the United Nations?
I sort of touched on that, but to the best of my ability.
Well, I will just say that as regards the issues that we're talking about, but certainly the ones that I work on, which are digital matters, telecommunications and data communications, of course, like many other regions, many other organizations, the UN is also organized on a regional basis. So that, for example, in the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, you have a European region, which curiously includes Russia, but nevertheless, where a lot of the cooperation on radio frequencies, etc., is done. In recent, what I would call plenary meetings of that organization, the vast majority of member countries have clearly shown through their voting their rejection of the attacks by Russia, to the extent even that certain candidates for high posts have been beaten resoundingly by other candidates as a result of that.
I look around for other questions, or I don't know whether questions have arrived on the internal system. Who else has a point he wants to raise or she wants to raise on issues which you discussed, or comments on the resilience of or the digital interaction with Ukraine?
Maybe I can say one thing,
Yes.
because we touched a lot in the beginning about how impressed we were with this resilience. And if there are some nerds here, actually Microsoft has published a report on all the cyber attacks that we've seen in very detailed way. So somebody are curious to look more into that. There is a public report where we're very transparent with what we've seen and done.
You mentioned the figures which you mentioned a moment ago, let's say about the increase, but also the resilience which there was as well. I mean, what you said, let's say, what the data which you had, let's say, is that it has increased enormously, but on the other hand, let's say the resistance has been high as well, which is surprising.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the attack we saw some years ago, not Patea, I don't know if you remember, but that completely paralyzed all their payment systems and other systems in the country for a few days. You know, we haven't seen something like that. So I think that, you know, in all modesty, the tech companies have played a really big role, not only Microsoft, but I also think they learned a lot from that attack back then. So, you know, their hygiene have maybe been a bit better. I think so.
And specifically for EU countries, we have also been the subject of attacks, but in that case from Russia. But again, I mean, we said that we were told in January, look, that will be massive, but so far. And why is this more limited than we thought? Or have we withstood very well? Or wasn't there sufficient disclosure about what happened? Yeah, if Piers wants to respond to that,
I have to, Carol, because I see that you're dying for gossip and hot news. There are some of these areas in which there will be no disclosure. So I advise you get a job in government, get the security clearance, and you might be told about some of it. Joking aside, there have been a massive number of attacks, quite a number of them extensive and also highly sophisticated. And the cybersecurity agencies in the member states have been working flat out to protect their own sort of national resource, but also to cooperate in what have been, as I said, in some cases, highly sophisticated attacks. So it is going to be part of the future. I wanted to say that one of the lessons we're going to learn we've all heard the term hybrid warfare, but it is clear, and perhaps worryingly, as Mark was saying, in terms of the sophistication of government and of the economy of Ukraine, it is as economies become more sophisticated digitally, they become more vulnerable from digital attack. And this is why cybersecurity on an exponential basis becomes more and more important and becomes part of a country's defense, national security defense. And that is a lesson which we are all learning and relearning, but there'll be no going back from that. And that is something which will have to also be factored in from a budget point of view, because it will be hugely expensive, including expensive to retrofit certain systems which the more developed, or countries which have been developed for longer, will need to do on existing digital infrastructures.
And if I can add to that, let's say, so since you're sitting in the middle of this, ENISA is basically your coordination agency for that. There have been criticism in the past they didn't have the means, let's say, to do this coordination. So this coordination has worked between the member states, between the cybersecurity entities of the member states?
I would obviously say yes, I think so. But the evidence is that you, as an informed commentator, haven't seen all that much evidence of the attacks. Of course, ENISA is not the only player. We repeat with modesty in the European Commission that, of course, it's a significant competence of the member states. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing has been cooperation. But the member states themselves have seen the necessity of very, very close coordination and cooperation. That will have to develop. We have, of course, the Cybersecurity Act. We have cyber certification. We have cyber resilience. We have a series, and we are going to also have a competence center for the underlying technical competence. So that constellation of initiatives, including regulatory, requiring investment, that is Europe's response to the permanent challenge of cybersecurity.
Will also be lessons to be learned for the EU 27 and soon more.
I said it at the beginning, first thing I said, we have a lot to learn from Ukraine and the Ukraine crisis.
Very important for us, let's say, also as a think tank, let's say, to hear this. Tina, you have something you want to add to this from your perspective, from the work done in the past on these matters?
Maybe I would just react to what just Piers has been saying, just being here the voice of the region that I'm working on. Yeah, that's really good that cybersecurity legislation of the EU is expanding. As you said, it's itself the new. We had the first review now, right, 2 years ago. Now we have all the follow-up legislation. But a question I think as an expert I would have here, and yeah, to what extent the EU agencies on digital and cybersecurity would be more open to cooperate with their neighbors. I mean, with Ukraine now this is happening, again, because of the emergency. But to what extent this, enhanced cooperation will be systematized, and to what extent it will simply include, the countries that are at the doorstep, that share the border with it, and make EU itself also vulnerable to this attack, so that otherwise these countries become the doorsteps of it. So I don't have a question on that, Carol, myself, but it's, I think, a good question to ask right now as the legislation is expanding and is being crafted now, so that we make the neighbors also ready to join in if they have the capacity and the will.
I look again into the room if there are anybody who has a point or a question he wants to raise on this issue. Yes, Rudolf?
Thanks, Rudolf Schomeyer from CBH Lawyers. I was a little bit puzzled by Mark's remark stressing the stable legal framework. Historically, I'm a lawyer, so I know what this means. But when I advised business associations there, what I realized in Ukraine was, before the war, I admit, it was not the legal frame. It was the double structure of decision-making. You have, let's say, the administration, and you have a parallel structure depending on the party lines. And you could never expect to understand who takes the decision finally. So maybe civil society has changed this during war now, and this I would be interested to understand, because for me, in my experience, more important is that this kind of party politics double structure is eliminated instead of having even more stable legal frameworks.
So, I mean, to respond to that, I think simply what I was saying, that I used a shorthand to say stable legal framework, so that businesses know when they make investment decisions there is a degree of certainty. I'm sure you're completely right that the previous governance challenges in Ukraine don't necessarily come from changing legal frameworks, but in terms of how the legal framework is applied and multiple, you described multiple decision-making structures. I think I'm not disagreeing with you at all. Simply using legal framework as a shorthand for stability and a good business environment where the private sector can operate.
Yes, I see a question at the back.
Yes, it seems that the Commission is thinking about war. Yes, sorry. Lieven Tayi, I'm a journalist. The Commission seems to think about war insurance, developing something like war insurance. What do you think in the EBRD about that? Because it seems rather questionable to ensure that companies invest in a country like Ukraine.
What's the question? Sorry, I don't understand.
Well, the idea of developing something as war insurance, specifically destined to companies in investing in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said earlier, I think given the stage we are at now, the priority at the moment is to support Ukraine with the immediate situation. As we progress, and I don't think anyone knows exactly how the war will develop, but as we go forwards, we should all hope that there is an environment where the private sector can invest. And yes, I think there is a question about whether it's possible to design a structure, a war insurance structure. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. But how do you create an environment where the private sector can make investment decisions, but potentially cover off the private sector against the risk of war damage? That would require, there's not, or in my view, I don't think there's going to be any kind of commercially available product that can do that. That would require donors to get together and to fund such a facility if it could be designed.
Any other comments? I mean, on war insurance related issues, I mean, and how do you cover for this? How do you, I mean, stimulate private sector to come in? Probably from peers or from Louisiana. I don't know whether you have picked up thinking within.
I have absolutely no idea about these questions. I'm intrigued, but I'm sorry, I just have no awareness of all as to what's being talked about. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's a very good point, let's say, because we know war is mostly an exception, I mean, to any insurance contract. No insurance contract covers it, so you have to think about ways to cover for this. Okay, any other questions, any other points anybody wants to raise? I mean, we have touched a lot of ground in this debate. And if there are no further, yeah, there's a question there. Yes, please. One moment. Take a microphone, otherwise you don't hear you.
Just, I am Mrs. Baromska. I worked at the European Commission. I am retired now. Just that we talk a lot of the future digitalization, and Mrs. Tina said that the skills are lacking in Ukraine. So I think, isn't it a bit too early to speak about that? There are more necessities in basic things for the time being. So you look forward to digitalizing Ukraine, but I think it's a bit early, isn't it? I don't know. You look ahead. Your think tank is looking ahead, but I don't know, there are so many basic things to take care of for the time being.
Maybe one small comment from me on this. We have millions of refugees in Poland. Most of them are women and kids. And one of the initiatives we have taken is to do some skilling initiatives for those women. So even though there are many other priorities, you know, this is one area where they can use the time in a meaningful way and, you know, be better prepared when they return to their country and can contribute to the rebuilding.
Thank you. I think it's a good question to be asked indeed. Thanks for the question. Many may wonder that, and I think the few numbers I've brought, it was just to underline, this is a sector which comes with certain flexibilities. You can deliver services, you can get remuneration, you can survive from month to month. We're talking a lot of people who are refugees, who still need to work to, you know, sustain themselves, and we're talking about millions of people who are jobless, and they will need to do some jobs after the war ends, right? So we need to come to that point prepared. The economy, especially the traditional sectors, they have there a lot of costs, adjustment costs, right? I mean, it's not that easy. But this is a sector where there are a lot of opportunities. You can still, you know, deliver services wherever you are from, as long as you have access to certain connectivity and you have skills to deliver the services. And this is why this is really a good, I think, starting point, that you keep thinking how you can upgrade the skills so these people are functional, they can earn their money, because we are talking about huge sums of the money that Ukraine needs to be a, you know, to continue being a functional country simply. So I don't think we can, you know, overlook this point. So it's good that we are, I think, thinking in this particular sector. And again, for Ukraine particularly, this is an important sector that has been growing quite fast, and there is a potential there. So something so basically that we focus now is really not in vain.
Thank you, Tina. And with this, I think we conclude this panel and move to another part. But let me thank Mark, Nana Louise, Piers, and Tina for a very interesting start of this discussion. But we're also using this opportunity, as we had this event together with the EBRD, to present a new report, which is the Law and Transition, which I leave to both Mike and Michael to present here. But probably I can give them the floor, and if I can thank the panelists again. And then Michael and Mike can explain what this EBRD initiative is. But as I said at the beginning, I know these transition reports from the EBRD very well, and I've used many of them, and we're using all the numbers. So as I said, transition remains an important issue.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Carol, and thank you for everyone for joining us. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today to launch the new issue of Law and Transition Journal, which Michelle can hold up. My name is Mike Strauss. I'm the General Counsel of the EBRD. I hope you're able to pick up a copy of the journal as you come in or as you go out. And thank you for participating online as well. You can access the journal on the link that's in the online page, which I think is over my head now. So why a legal journal? We've published this journal since 1992, if you can believe it. And that goes back to the first days of the EBRD. But nevertheless, I think that it always bears thinking from first principles. Why do you do this, and is it something you should continue to do? Why is it relevant? The journal publicizes the wide range of achievements of our legal transition program, the LTP. LTP, which dates also back to the founding of the EBRD, is an initiative by the bank to help its countries of operations upgrade their legal frameworks for investment through law reform and institution building. And indeed, it goes back to some of the comments we've discussed before, precisely for Ukraine, but for other countries of operations as well. LTP at EBRD is animated by a simple theory. It's basically this, that good laws make for good economies. This proposition is now, I think, very widely accepted among institutions and among development specialists. So our legal transition program focuses on a number of areas directly connected to commercial activity, given EBRD's private sector focus. Those are corporate governance, dispute resolution, energy, climate change, infrastructure, financial law, and public procurement. We assist governments in our countries of operations with legislative reforms and institution building in each of these areas. To give a few examples, this could be about preparing a new insolvency law in Armenia, or a new factoring law in Ukraine. It could be about training officials in PPPs in Montenegro. It could be about promoting commercial mediation in Moldova, or training judges on commercial law in the Kyrgyz Republic. A second reason the journal is essential is that it allows us to highlight our work as it advances core areas of EBRD's strategic focus. The new issue of the journal showcases a few stories on our work in the digitalization sector, which is highly relevant for the moment. In particular, helping governments to digitalize their services. The topics and countries are varied, and I'm sure you can find something of interest in the journal. The digital agenda appeared over the past few years as a cross-cutting theme in all of LTP's work, and the pandemic has, of course, accelerated this movement. During the lockdowns, digital platforms were often the only way for citizens to access government services. Courthouses were closed, and this boosted interest for online courts everywhere. And in many cases, this digital transformation processes that were going ploddingly under the original processes had to be completed in an instant. We heard from the panel a few minutes ago how important this digital transformation process will be, particularly in the Eastern Neighbourhood of countries, and how IFIs like EBRD can help. LTP's work in this area has included open government principles for the digitalization of health services in the Slovak Republic, creating digital platforms to handle information on mining resources in Mongolia, using electronic procurement to select the private partners in PPP projects. But this is just scratching the surface, and my colleague Michel Nussbaumer, who's the editor-in-chief of the journal, will talk about two particular articles in a minute. Third, there's a secondary focus in the journal, which is the green agenda, which is another cross-cutting theme in our EBRD activities. It's also, as Mark said earlier, a key focus of the bank, a strategic focus of the bank. We've actually committed as a bank to align all of our activities with the Paris Accord by the end of this year. Of particular interest is an excellent article on saving biodiversity and our natural capital through technology, standards, and regulations. With that then, let me encourage you to read the new issue of Law and Transition. Give us feedback if you like. And many thanks for your attention and interest. Let me turn it over to Michel Nussbaumer to give us a flavor of some of the particular articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today to launch the new issue of our journal, Law in Transition. So all stories in the journal deserve reading, of course, but I would like to draw your attention to two particular ones. And the reason I selected them is because of the lessons learned they contain. The first lesson that emerged when we prepared this report is that by putting in place digital tools, countries can reap combined benefits. And the case in point is the story on Mongolia that Mike just mentioned about the mining sector. It's on page 44 in the journal. And it explains how the bank helped Mongolia put in place a digital platform, a digital database on geological information on mining resources. Now you have to picture the situation. Mongolia is a very poor country, but has these huge mineral resources, and we're talking gold and copper in particular. But in order for investors to come, they need to have access to geological information. And the situation was very difficult in Mongolia because all this information was held by different agencies across the country in paper format, old maps, very often dating back to the Soviet times, in Mongolian and Russian language. So we're talking about millions of pages of documents. So it was very difficult for investors to access the information in this very obsolete regime. The EBRD had policy dialogue with the authorities, and they decided to put in place the first national geo-information database. The work was done in 2019 to 2021. And the project helped them design the database, put in place processes to digitize the information, training officials, and creating a collaboration with peers in other countries, in particular in Australia. And as a result, Mongolia now has a cutting-edge database of geological information on mining resources. Now, I talk about combined benefits. What do I mean by that? Well, the benefits of this initiative have been twofold. First, by making all this information available, it has boosted investor interest, so boosted the investment into the country. And the second benefit is that by creating transparency, it has improved the governance of the mining sector, so it helps curb corruption. And by the way, this is an initiative that we are contemplating replicating in other countries, possibly in Ukraine, where it would be very relevant with the anti-corruption aspect. So that was the first story. The second lesson actually is that there are still big gaps in our country's operations, in their investment climate. And organizations like EBRD can help address these gaps via digital tools. And the story here is the one called Information Matters, a new digital resource for SMEs across the EBRD region on page 52. So we observed that there was a gap in available information for SMEs on how to be resilient to the COVID crisis. In other countries, in other parts of the world, like in Ireland, in Australia or Canada, this information is readily available from government sources or sometimes from the private sector. But there was no such thing in our countries. So we created freely accessible websites. First, a general one for the entire region in English and in Russian, and then 3 focused websites for 3 particular countries, and they all happen to be part of the Eastern Partnership. It's Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. So website in local language and giving advice on things like how to develop your business strategy, how to manage people, how to run the business, how to take it online, how to keep your finances healthy, and how to restructure the business when things go bad. There was also guidance on tax privileges that were put in place in connections with the pandemic in Moldova and Georgia, for example. And we promoted these websites through webinars, through social media, with the help of local stakeholders like the investor councils. And there was a good reaction. In the first 5 months, 37,000 visits in Georgia, 27,000 in Moldova, and 23,000 in Ukraine. And the next step was to put in place an online newsletter with updates on the information on the website. So clearly there was a gap. This tool has helped address the gap, and hopefully this will benefit these countries. So these were the 2 stories I wanted to mention. I really encourage you to have a look at our journal and enjoy the reading. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, and thank you to the EBRD. We see that there is still a lot of information need on this country, so I think this will fill that gap to some degree, certainly since we are not yet part of the EU. For EU, we have a lot of information, but for non-EU countries, there is still a lot to be filled. And if you go further east, I think there is even more need for information. Of course, they are partnership countries or associate states, but once you go a bit further, we know how difficult it is to get the information. Yes, I know. I have to announce that also EBRD is inviting us to a drink here after this event. So from my perspective, thank you very much. Unless anybody has any comment to make to this announcement, we look forward to seeing you again and to have further discussions. There will certainly be an issue which will follow up here at CEPS. There is a lot to be said about this. Like we had a debate last week on the European political community, or la Communauté Européenne, la Communauté Politique Européenne, which remains a strange term. But of course, there will be a lot to discuss about further enlargement of the EU and how we will do this. So again, thank you, Michael and Michel, for this debate. Thank you for the others from the EBRD who are around, and thank you for having this organized with us. Thank you very much.